their music, it grows sadder and it grows deeper and it grows stronger until with one piercing note, which is probably the incarnation, everything stops. This idea of the world being created out of music, and the idea of Satan introducing disharmony into it, this pops up so many times just sort of casually in Catholic writing. Even as a young man, he recognized that we lost so much sense of meaning and purpose and beauty, and he felt this responsibility with his friends. All but one of his friends died in World War I. He felt this intense and sort of personal responsibility to see if there's a spark that could be kindled in the world. And so I think young people, whether Protestant, Christian, Catholic, evangelical, or nothing, who come to Tolkien, found a world that was richer and more interesting. Tolkien says all this thing is about the fall and mortality in the machine. That's what his work is always about, the fall, mortality in the machine. And this is fall, right? It's this primordial sin, Cain and Abel. Frodo fails at the end, right? Gollum's nearly redeemed. Sam, who is the most selfless character in the book, who is the real hero of the book, it's his act of unthinking hostility to Gollum that ultimately leads Gollum to his final rejection of grace. Christianity takes this archetypal story and makes it the central thing that you meditate on in every single Mass. Every single Mass, you're meditating on the descent of Christ into the incarnation, the passion of Christ, his death, burial, resurrection, ascension. Every Mass has that pattern. And so when Tolkien sets out to write characters, yeah, he's going to do the archetype that everybody else does, but that archetype is going to have the Christ stamp on it so very clearly.
Hey guys, I am very excited about our guest today, Dr. Ben Reinhard. He is professor of English at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, and his areas of focus revolve around J.R.R. Tolkien. In particular, he focuses on Anglo-Saxon literature and Middle English literature, as well as the Inklings, Tolkien, Lewis, and some of their friends. He is just a wealth of knowledge in the space of really anything Anglo-Saxon, but primarily Tolkien. He spent a lot of his career focusing on studying the life and the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien. So this is going to be a fascinating interview. I'm very excited that you're joining us for it. If you haven't already, before we get into the interview, please subscribe to the channel. Helps the channel out a lot and helps us to reach more people. Let's get to the interview. Guys, if you are a fan of J.R.R. Tolkien, then I have a treat for you today. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Ben Reinhard. He is professor at Franciscan University in Steubenville. Dr. Reinhard, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
I am so excited. I'm a massive Tolkien nerd. I got into Tolkien a little bit differently. I tried to read him when I was in high school. And I wasn't a Christian at the time either when I tried to read Tolkien. And it was just, I couldn't consume it. It was too much over my head. I got lost in a lot of the names. So many of the different names, I just couldn't do it. My mind, you get this teenage brain, just couldn't handle it. I took a lot longer to mature than some other people might. But I came back to it later on after I had became a Christian. I think it was 26 or 27. And what hooked me in actually is I was listening to it. And I think it's is it Inglis who does the voice? Yes, he does an excellent job. And he was I learned the names. We were going through the Silmarillion, and he gave me the actual pronunciation of the names, and that's what kind of hooked me into it. So I guess what I would like to do right off the bat is if you could tell a little bit of your backstory. I understand you're a convert to Catholicism, but also my question is, did Tolkien play a role in your conversion at all?
So the answer is, to that question is going to be yes and no, or maybe it's no and yes, but we'll get to that in a second. So I was raised in an Anabaptist household. So Anabaptists include, the Amish and the Mennonites. We were a more modern version of Anabaptists. It looked a lot like, sort of a lot of conservative Protestants in America. Mm-hmm. And I had, honestly, a pretty ideal and idyllic childhood in lots of ways. It was like being raised in the Shire, where sort of small community, all your cousins and second cousins and third cousins and things like that. And so really quite a nice, beautiful upbringing. So many good things to say about the community I was raised in. One of the things, though, to say about that community is so good, so kind, so supportive, and those things are beautiful. One of the things that Anabaptism doesn't tend to like is Catholicism, right?
Absolutely.
You know, the reason for Anabaptism existing is the rejection of infant baptism, and it's about as anti-sacramental a community as you can probably have, right? And again, I don't mean to throw shade on them because they're wonderful people who love Christ very dearly. That being said, that's actually where, as Tolkien is a sort of a preparation for conversion, Tolkien's world is a sacramental world, right? And you're not going to read Tolkien and you're not going to get apologetical arguments. You're not going to get truths of the faith laid out explicitly or even allegorically, right? He's not going to do that like others might. But what he does is, as a Catholic writer, he so thoroughly expresses that Catholic imagination in his work that to read it is in some way to be sort of imaginatively prepared, right? So the two ways that Tolkien laid groundwork for my conversion was, in the first place, there was the imaginative preparation. You know, if somebody has read Tolkien a dozen times, you come to the church and you find out about Marian devotion, and it doesn't feel quite as weird, right? You come and you find out that you find out about the sacraments, you find out about liturgy, and it doesn't feel quite so weird anymore because you've been in that mental space a little bit more. That's the first way. The second way is, I guess I would put it, my conversion when I came to the church, I had a process of about 5 years where I discovered that everyone I liked was Catholic, right? So everyone who I was inspired in reading, everyone who I thought had a really compelling account of the world was Catholic, and there was sort of this like conspiracy almost. And Tolkien was sort of central in that, where starting off it was just, he's a fantasy writer. But when I was starting to explore Catholicism in my early 20s, it was, oh no, Tolkien, this guy who you admire so much, is Catholic, and he's really Catholic, and so he was part of Catholic, that credibility building thing.
Yeah, man. So if you don't mind me asking, who were some of those people you looked up to? You mentioned the five. Who were the big five?
Oh, the big five. So let's see here. So there's Tolkien. There's going to be Chesterton. You know, things that were really frustrating to me as a Protestant. I found Peter Kreeft's writing when I was a Protestant. Yes. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, this guy who writes like C.S. Lewis in the 21st century, secretly Catholic, right? Or not secretly, but secretly as far as I knew.
Yeah.
Let's see. I really leaned a lot on some of Budziszewski's writings, J. Budziszewski,
yes.
when I was an undergrad, and it's like, oh, he's Catholic too, right? And let's see, if I want to round out with a big five. So for earlier writers, I do Chesterton and Tolkien. For modern writers, I do Kreeft and Budziszewski. And you know what? And then the fifth, I'm gonna have to punt on the fifth. I'll give you four.
Okay. I was waiting. It's funny. I've ran across a few people who are T.S. Eliot. I love T.S. Eliot. But for some reason, the Tolkien, people who love Tolkien don't seem to love T.S. Eliot as much. And then the same thing back and forth. I don't know why, but I've just ran across that.
So you know, I think that's true, but I'm going to say I don't like that split. Okay. So I think it'd be hard to be a C.S. Lewis guy and be a T.S. Eliot guy at the same time, right?
Okay.
Because Lewis so vocally and so frequently critiques Eliot and his poetry and things like that. It would be hard to be a completely committed Lewisian and a completely committed Eliot person.
Absolutely.
That being said, I think Tolkien is sort of further in one direction, Eliot's further in another, but it's almost like a horseshoe theory where I think if you're interested in imagination and you're interested in faith, I think there are ways that, even though Tolkien and Lewis Tolkien and Eliot are sort of on opposite sides of Lewis, they sort of, I think, converge a little bit.
Yeah.
And no, I like The Wasteland, and I like Tolkien. I think that's possible.
Yeah. So you mentioned Tolkien made it easier to convert in, and I had the same exact experience. I remember the first time I ever entered into a mass. I was lucky enough to go to a cathedral mass, and I'm there. It's a beautiful, beautiful mass, and it's just these giant vaulted ceilings. and listening to Rob Inglis read The Lord of the Rings. And I wonder if Tolkien actually wrote some of the, I'm sure he did, as in depth as he was, but actually wrote some of the music of the elves singing and some of the different, I actually wrote it out. But I was listening to the choir sing in the cathedral, and I'm sitting there thinking, this sounds like the Lord of the Rings. This sounds exactly like the high elvish songs that were sang, and it was just, it blew my mind. And I was, to your point, I was prepared. It prepared me more for what I was entering into. But I had no clue. I had no clue that Tolkien was as deeply Catholic as he was at the time. It took me a long time to learn that. And I understand. I've heard you speak on this before. I understand that the world of Middle Earth started with this Arendil character. And could you elaborate on that and talk a little bit about how Tolkien kind of stumbled across Middle Earth in his mind?
I absolutely can. And this is the perfect time. You know, we're in the season of Advent. There's no better time to talk about Eärendil. So when Tolkien is an undergraduate at Oxford, he's starting to study Old English. And when you're starting to study Old English, one of the things that you often get is this poem called Christ One. It's also called the Advent Lyrics. And the Advent lyrics are basically sort of poetic expansions on the great O antiphons that we pray, you know, the last few days before Christmas. And the O Dayspring, O Radiant Dawn, Oriens, however you want to translate that. In Old English, it becomes, I'm going to mangle the quote, so, you know, don't fact check me on this. Alla Eärendil engla beorchtast over Midgard manum sended. So, O you Eärendil, brightest of angels, sent over Middle Earth unto mankind. And then it talks about, you know, sort of the deliverance that this Dayspring character brings. And Tolkien reading this, he was struck by that word Eärendil for a couple of reasons. One is, it's such a beautiful word. He says, Old English is it's a nice language, but it's not usually that beautiful, where words just sound so wonderful. So there was the euphonic quality of it. But then there was also sort of a mysterious quality because it doesn't look like other Old English words. It was sort of hard to make sense of what this was. And Tolkien believes that it was originally a proper name, and there's some reason for believing that. And so he says, okay, so let's imagine this is a proper name. Let's imagine that there's a person called Eärendil. What would the story be of this sort of type of Christ? And this gives you Eärendil, who later plays such a large part then in the Silmarillion and even in the Lord of the Rings. And it's, what does he call it? The rapturous germ from which sprang all my mythology, right? So right there, undergraduate in Oxford before World War I, he's reading Old English. He comes across this lyrical meditation on liturgical prayer, and this little kernel of it just sort of takes root in his mind, and it blossoms, and there you go.
Man, and that's so good. And Eärendil ended up being my favorite character after reading through them so many times. Just, you know, it's something that you wouldn't necessarily get just by reading through The Lord of the Rings, and that's what I stumbled across when I started reading the Silmarillion. And just, man, The Lord of the Rings is really this tiny part of this much larger work that was really his passion his entire life. And some of my questions, my fascination with Tolkien is in The Lord of the Rings, but really with the Silmarillion, because I read his Genesis account, the Ainulindale, and I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. Is that how you pronounce it?
I think that's so. You know what? I'm bad. I don't know Elvish pronunciation. So I've heard Ainulindale and I've heard Ainulindale, and I think Ainulindale sounds good. So let's
Okay,
go.
okay. Going off Rob Inglis again, but
Yeah.
I listened to that, and it's always, you know, that question: why did God create us? Why are we here? And to hear kind of Tolkien's way of his fashion of giving it a story of a potential reason, this song that was sung, the song of the Ainur. And this song became more beautiful and more beautiful the more that was involved into it. If you could give some insight, and I want to say this as well, you have written a book. I have not read it. It's actually, I'm hoping it's under the tree this Christmas. I want to read it. But the High Hallow, and I'm assuming you talk about quite a bit of this in your book, but if you could give some insight into that Genesis account, that what does Tolkien get into? What kind of Catholic theology can we parse from this?
Yeah. So his Genesis accounts, his Genesis 1 is this Ainulindale, right? And it's a creation account, and it's God creating the world out of nothing. It's the rebellion of Satan before the world begins, and it's God's providential plan then to sort of bring creation back to him. All of that. is bound up in this one chapter, this introductory chapter to the Silmarillion. And the thing that's really interesting about it is Tolkien takes hints that are sort of embedded in mythologies across the world and embedded in the Old Testament and sort of English poetry, that the origin of the world is in fact harmony and music, right? So all of the angels come together and they sing together. And even though God, or Eru, is the true creator, right? He's the only one creator. He allows them to participate in this act of creation. And you've got this huge music joined together before the throne of God. And it's out of that it's from that he creates the world, right? It's from that he brings the world into being. And you've got the fall, right? When Melkor, the greatest of the angels, the greatest of the Ainur, decides to start weaving things in that are of his own devising, that aren't part of God's original plan. And his music becomes loud and repetitive. It basically becomes, like a rock power ballad, just sort of droning on and on. But then the music that Iluvatar has sung, he raises up one theme after another to overcome the music of Melkor. And the beautiful thing is, what he does at the end is he raises up his children, right? He raises up the elves and the men who are going to participate in this healing of the world. And so Melkor is stronger, but their music, it grows sadder and it grows deeper and it grows stronger until with one piercing note, which is probably the incarnation, everything stops and the music doesn't go on past that. Wow. So it's a really beautiful analogy for how the world's created. And actually when I was writing the book, I found out it's the craziest thing. This idea of the world being created out of music, and the idea of Satan introducing disharmony into it, this pops up so many times just sort of casually in Catholic writing. There's a book by Scott Hahn where that exact analogy is used. And I asked him, did you or your co-author read this beforehand? And they hadn't. Fulton Sheen uses the same analogy at one point. And again, completely independently. But that's
interesting.
Yeah, no. It's just this thing that sort of keeps popping up because it's such a powerful image and it's such a suggestive image. And there's a unique truth that you can tell through the story that way, I think.
Yeah. And there's mystery in music at the same time when you listen to something that's really deep. So it's kind of explanatory, but at the same time, it's still mysterious.
Yeah.
That's so good. And that kind of ties into a little bit like, was Tolkien worried about writing this epic mythology? Was he worried about this, in light of him being a very devout Christian? Was he worried about someone misconstruing that?
So I don't think deeply worried about misconstrual, but indeed worried about how you can, as a Christian, write this epic fantasy, right? Because one thing that you have to do is you kind of have to keep God off stage a little bit. Because if you're doing the epic fantasy and it'd be hard to do epic fantasy with Christians, right? Because then the doubt and the anxiety and the darkness wouldn't have the same note when the final victory is so clearly assured. And you also can't make God the primary subject of fantasy because that's sort of offensive to belief and piety, right? You can't make him the subject of a fairy tale. So you don't want to do either of those things. On the other hand, when he starts thinking about his fall narrative and in the history of Middle Earth, you get this full story of how the human race fell. He's like, well, ultimately, it's almost like I'm writing a parody of Genesis 3 because when you touch the fundamental truths, whether it's creation or fall or redemption, you can't write it in a pattern other than the true pattern. So what does Satan do? Satan comes to men. Satan deceives them through fear of darkness and fear of death. And it's through this fear of death that they rebel. And it's Genesis 3, But so I'd say he's conscious of the difficulty and he's very careful to balance it. There are times when he dives into the deepest weeds that he can't actually avoid it.
Absolutely. I didn't know if that was a concern of him because that's, a lot of people will argue against Tolkien writing this, saying that it's a mythology. He created gods. He created these different aspects of it. And it's kind of, it's kind of interesting. I wonder if some of those people have read it. And
Yeah.
this leads me into a whole nother can of worms, but I find it so fascinating. Lord of the Rings being this pinnacle fantasy novel that changed how the genre really works. Like, it changed everything about it. You went from just softback covers to hardback covers. It changed the entire space. But as he was writing this, you have Christians, you have Catholics, you have non-Catholics, you have Calvinists, you have people fall in love with this story. And I know from you looking at it and from myself now looking at it, I can see the Catholicism just so heavily intertwined throughout everything that he's written, and it makes it far more beautiful. I want to get to this in a second. You talk about the concept of liturgical imagination. I want to hear more about that. But prior to that, why do you think this is so appealing to Christian and non-Christian alike?
Oh, gosh. So I think the primary reason is because Tolkien, whether he directly intended this or whether it was sort of inadvertent, he directly intended it. He created something that the modern world desperately needed, right? Even as a young man, he recognized that we had lost so much sense of meaning and purpose and beauty, and he felt this responsibility with his friends. And then after all but one of his friends died in World War One, he felt this intense and sort of personal responsibility to carry on this work and to see if there's a spark that could be kindled in the world. And then with Lord of the Rings, I think what happened is, again, there are a lot of good things about the 20th century. There are lots of accomplishments in the 20th century, but the 20th century wasn't high on sort of like spiritual satisfaction, spiritual depth, right? Material progress, absolutely. Economic progress, sure. But there was a spiritual emptiness that had already begun in the early 20th century, and it only increases as the century's rolling on. And so I think young people, whether Christian, whether Protestant Christian, Catholic, evangelical, or nothing, who come to Tolkien, found a world that was richer and more interesting, and found a world that offered them something that the modern world had denied. And that's why when Tolkien's writing at the end of his life, he says, reflecting on the wholly unexpected things that have happened since the novel's publication, it's almost like the present darkness has been rolled back and the horns of hope have been heard again. So he's playing with that whole Rohirrim arriving at the Pelennor Fields. Like, this is sort of the herald of the new dawn. And that success comes, I think, from somebody whose imagination was seeped in a Catholic order, who set to subcreate a beautiful fantasy, and in so doing created something that was exactly what the world was hungry for. So I think those are sort of the three steps.
What do you think Tolkien, because you're right, it's all, I mean, he could not stand the Industrial Revolution. I love that about him. We're falling back as mankind. What do you think if he could step into 2025? Here we are at the tail end of it. What do you think he would say? What do you think he would look around? What do you think he would say in particular to Christians?
My gosh, that's a terrifying question. I think the simplest thing he would say, and I know there's an irony in this because you and I are talking over our computers right now. He would say, don't worship the machine. I think he would say, don't worship the machine, because this is something that's sort of a running theme in so much of what he writes. It's in on fairy stories. It's in The Hobbit. It's massively in Lord of the Rings, right? This idea that we can, by our efforts and by our tools, reverse the fall, seize immortality, make ourselves gods, and then, the powerful rule the machines and the weak are ruled by them. I think the biggest thing would be, don't worship the machine.
Man, that's so good. And that's the most difficult thing we think about. We have folks who spend their entire day in front of a screen for work, and that is, you're right, Tolkien would have been entirely against it. So on that same frame of mind, getting back into some of the imaginative properties of it that you mentioned a minute ago, what are some things, like there's some more obvious types of Catholicity that he puts into his work. You think of the way bread of the elves, the limbus, this bread that sustains you for long journeys. Just a little nibble of it will do it. That's an outcry for the Eucharist. As I read this prior to being Catholic, I thought, oh, this is just a great chunk of bread. I had no idea. What are some things in the story or in all of it, in Middle Earth whatsoever, that you could say, hey, these are examples of Christianity, or these are examples of a Catholicity throughout that's not so evident, because he was a master at not being allegorical. And it was just, it's beautiful how he did it. What are some examples you could give us of those?
All right. So you know what? I think I'm gonna give you my favorite one, and then we can talk about other ones too that I think are really really great. So
Okay.
so it's at the end of Return of the King, right? Aragorn has been crowned, but he's waiting for this sign of restoration, right? And he's waiting in some anxiety because he's king and it's great, but what's going to happen to the world when he's gone? He doesn't know about this. Gandalf takes him up to the mountain, up to the High Hallow, which is where I took the title of my book from. And it's there that they find the tree, which goes back to the trees of Valinor. And they find the sapling, they plant the sapling, the tree grows, and then Arwen comes, there's the marriage, and everything is sort of brought to its consummation. Now, why do I think that's like this weird Catholic echo? There are a couple reasons. One is because if you go into the Silmarillion, if you go into the other sort of, unfinished tales kinds of writings, and if you go into Tolkien's letters, worship is degraded in Middle Earth. He tells you that worship is degraded in Middle Earth by the time the Third Age rolls around. And only really areas of Numenorean influence still have a sense of God. And it's after Aragorn comes back and you've got the king priest, right? Because that's what he is. You've got this king priest on the mountain underneath the tree. And that's when the worship is renewed, echoing the worship that had been in Numenor, looking forward to, I think, some other forms of worship. And that's when sort of everything is restored. He says, once we've restored the dynasty of king priests, we're going to have worship again in Middle Earth. So I think that's like one little nugget. I think there are two fun things you can do with it. One is, my colleague John Bergsman here at Franciscan, he does the Bible Basics for Catholics. He draws the little stick figure illustrations. If you draw a little stick figure illustration of a king priest, on a hill under a tree, like this is this sort of Edenic imagery, right? This is this sort of natural, sacramentalized imagery. And it's not just Aragorn who does it, because at the end of the book, you also have Samwise Gamgee doing the same thing. He's the king priest in the Shire, under the tree, on the mountain. And it's like, so that's this little sort of ghost of religion that exists in Tolkien's world, and I think that's a fun thing. I love the window on the west. You got Faramir and his men, having their moment of silence, looking towards Numenor that was, Elvenhome that is, and that which is beyond Elvenhome and shall ever be. That tiny little act of thanksgiving and worship. I think that's really really nice. The very best stuff I think is reserved for the Silmarillion, but the Lord of the Rings gives you a bit.
Let me ask you about the Halls of Mandos. What exactly are the Halls of Mandos? And I have a follow-up question about Feanor, because I understand Feanor also goes to the Halls. So what is Tolkien getting at?
So, stepping back, right? What are the Ainur? First question. The Ainur are angels and they're gods, right? Or they're sort of splitting the difference, where they act in the story like the gods would in Greek or Norse mythology, but they are beings who, Tolkien says, can be accepted by a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity. So they are angel governors of the world, right? So Mandos is our Hades figure, right? He's sort of the keeper of the dead. So the halls of Mandos, it's where, in the first place, all elves go when they die, unless they're going to come out and be reincarnated, because elves are bound to the world, so they can take bodies again if they want to, after a time. And it's where men go for a bit, but men's destiny is beyond the walls of the world. So the souls of men don't stay there. So it's this, you can't quite call it limbo. Limbo is not quite the right word for men, but it's this intermediate state, before we go on to that sort of final judgment.
Would it be fair for men? Well, I guess it wouldn't be a purgatory, because all men go there, correct?
It seems like that's where all men are going to go.
Okay.
I don't know if he's ever explicit on that, but the sort of the purgatorial imagery, it's not the craziest thing. And certainly when you think about how it works for the elves, right? the elves, especially those who have something to sort of work out, they're there until the purgation is effected, and then they can take their bodies again. So I think as a sort of reflex of purgatory, I think you can make it work.
That's good. And staying kind of in that same age, or I guess that's through all the ages, but I guess in the first age, there's just so much. I think of the crossing of the Hill Caraxi, which is another one of my favorite words that he gives. That's such a cool word, and just his ability of language. What are some of the significance of that first kinslaying as they're leaving Valinor? What is Tolkien trying? If you could also give some of the backstory for the people who are listening who may not know this story.
Yeah. So the backstory is the massively simplified version, right? Mm-hmm. Satan, Melkor, has been chained by the other angels, and he's been in Valinor. He introduces strife when he's released in Valinor as sort of a servant. And he corrupts Feanor, who is the greatest of the elves. And he starts whispering into his mind the same sorts of rebellion that caused him to rebel in the first place. The idea that he's being hemmed in, the idea that he's not being respected enough, the idea that he needs to sort of carve out his own destiny. So those fundamental rejections of gratitude, those fundamental stirrings of pride are almost always going to be where falls come from for Tolkien. So Feanor, the greatest elf, he is starting to rebel, simplifying the story. Melkor steals his greatest artifacts, these 3 holy jewels, the Silmaril, and Melkor goes. Feanor at this point full-on rebels against the angel regents of the world, and he's marching off to get his own back and to lead his group of the elves into their sort of glorious destiny. Now, his group of elves are great builders. They're great craftsmen. They make great armor. They don't have boats. There's another kindred of the elves who have all the boats. They won't give boats to rebels. And so what happens is Feanor leads his men against the Teleri in the at the Havens. So you have elf slaying elf in paradise. And that's the short story of what happens. Why the kinslaying matters. Tolkien says, all this thing is about the fall and mortality in the machine. That's what his work is always about. Fall, mortality in the machine. And this is fall, right? It's this primordial sin. It's Cain and Abel. It's Cain and Abel following on sort of rebellion against authority. So it's Cain and Abel following on Adam and Eve. After this, all the elves who follow Feanor and are party to this rebellion are cursed with a doom. And when they go out to try to wage their righteous war, in many ways it is a righteous war in Middle-earth, they've got this doom from the kinslaying that haunts them all the way through. And it's psychological and it's spiritual, and sometimes it's almost bodily. So it is the fall or a fall for all the elves, which is, side note, this is really important because whenever we read The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, the elves are just good people, and they appear as just good people. In reality, in the history, there's the rebellion, and there's the fall, and then there's the long, slow ascent back, which we only see sort of the end product of by the time we get to Hobbit and Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think one of the mind-blowing things is how Tolkien uses the elves throughout. I didn't realize this for forever. I didn't realize that the orcs were really just a disfigurement of the elves initially. Mm-hmm. And it's such an interesting concept, and I guess it's hard to apply, but you think about these creatures who were made by God and made good by God, but they're so, in the beginning, Satan gets to them, this Melkor character gets to them, and it makes them so fearful of the things that are good. All of a sudden, one of the angels, I can't remember who it was, maybe Orome, but he comes across and they're fearful of him. They're fearful of him because of the fear put into them by Satan of this character that's coming. And the ones that were very fearful, they were taken by Melkor. Melkor took them over time and they become the orcs. It's just seeing all this imagery. I mean, it could go on and on and on throughout that Tolkien put into this work. But it's those things that you see and like, oh, I can apply this to my own world. This is exactly how the world works. And one of the first things when I was reading this as a Protestant is I was always or hit with this point that how can I help my fellow man? To your point about your conversion and Tolkien softening you to Catholicism, that softened me because it's just this explicit work throughout all of his stuff that you can help your fellow man. You can be a deep help, or you can help damn your fellow
Yeah.
man, and that's such a key theme. I have two other pieces of Middle Earth I want to ask you about. Should we, as Catholics, be concerned with what Tolkien wrote about Denethor?
Why would we?
I can give you more on that. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Why are we concerned about Denethor?
so the king returns. Denethor, being the steward, does not want to give up the stewardship. He's aware of the king returning. Well, I guess you can argue that maybe he wasn't. But what was Tolkien saying in that imagery there?
So one thing that I don't think he's doing, although I think we can apply it this way, but I don't think he's doing it this way. I don't think he's making an allegory of the papacy, right?
Okay.
Some people have pushed it to, hey, Aragorn's the returning king, and that therefore the steward, the vicar, if you want, right? the vicar is Denethor, and it's this corrupt ruler and all this. Now, I don't think that level of allegory was intended by Tolkien, although, again, he always allows it. You can apply it how you want. So I'll say two things. The one thing I'll say is if I wanted to apply it to church politics, I would say it's actually a counsel of hope in hard times, right? It's a counsel of hope because the good people of Minas Tirith keep hoping for the king's return. They stay obedient to the steward who, in his own way, sits in the high seat, not in the throne, but he sits in the high seat. And you just do your best, right? And I think, in some ways, I think that's all that's ever asked of us, no matter what sort of fears or anxieties or scandals might emerge. So if I wanted to apply it, I do it that way. I don't so much want to apply it there because I think Denethor is more interesting than just that sort of allegory of clerical office, right? Here you've got somebody who was good and was noble and had, gifts that exceed any of our gifts. And what was it that brings him down, right? It's the pride, it's the possessiveness, it's that small act of hubris and thinking that he could solve everything himself, right? He's a great man, but he commits himself to so much to the things that are directly in front of him, the political problems, the military problems, everything else, that he stops being able to see anything else. So he becomes tainted by mere politics, is I think what Tolkien says. He becomes tainted by politics and loses the sight of the final end for which his rule and his life exists.
That's really good. I love that. Well, I want to ask this: do you you probably don't, but have you read any modern fantasy, any fantasy that's come out in the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years?
So, not so much. A long time ago, I started reading Robert Jordan. And so
Wheel of Time.
Wheel of Time, and the New York Times modestly saying that Jordan has come to dominate the world that Tolkien begun to reveal. That caught my attention. I've started some other modern fantasies, but I haven't persevered in any of these 10,000 page series.
I was going to ask you what you think Tolkien would say about modern fantasy. He's very opinionated on other writers, which I love. Gives you an insight into who he was. I've read a lot of modern fantasy, trying to kind of find that not next Tolkien, but something closer to it, something that would just get to your heart as much as he did. And there was a series by Brandon Sanderson that came out called The Cosmere, and he kind of marketed it as this is his Tolkien, this is his epoch. And I read it, and it just didn't seem close. And it also it violated some natural law principles. And in violating those principles, it totally kicks you out of the story. Hopefully, if you are blessed enough to be a right-thinking individual and you can identify it. So I wonder why is it that when you read Tolkien, it is so different? It's so have you read Stephen R. Lawhead's The Pendragon Cycle?
I have, yeah.
Yes. So I find that the books are kind of separated a little bit. It's not there's much continuity, but I think it's an incredible series. He does a great job with the Arthurian legend, and
Hmm.
it seems more Tolkien-esque, but it's still not what you got from J.R.R. Tolkien himself.
Yeah.
Why is it that his work is not only so deep, but when I read it, I come away from it feeling more courage. I feel more courageous just to walk around in life.
Yeah. So I think, again, I think you've got a couple things that are coinciding in his work, right? You've got someone who is, I'll say, I think the greatest author of the 20th century, right? You've got the greatest author of his century who is accomplishing something completely new in the history of literature. Nobody's ever done this before. And that sort of achievement is not going to, it's not to be had for the asking. You don't get it just by wanting it, right? So with other writers, I think once you understand what Tolkien achieved, it explains why other writers don't seem so fresh. Like, yeah, I love Stephen Lawhead. It's been a while since I've read him, but the Pendragon Cycle, and then he's got the Silver Hand series, right? It's like
Yeah.
those things I found very, very moving, but they didn't do quite the same thing, right? Because I think Lawhead has two things working against him. One is he can't create a world out of nothing like Tolkien did, because anyone who tries to create a world out of nothing, you're just imitating Tolkien in some way. No matter how you create the world, everyone says you're just doing the Tolkien thing, right? Um, and then because Lawhead can't do that, he's forced to rely on Welsh myth, or he's forced to rely on the sort of Atlantis, Merlin, Taliesin thing, and that's really, really cool, but it doesn't have that same deep immersion, because we can believe that Middle Earth actually existed and completely enter that world. I regrettably know that if I could hop in a time machine and go back to Wales 1,500 years ago, I'm not going to find Arthur doing exactly what he does in the Lawhead books. So I think those are the disadvantages. And for the modern fantasy writers, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want the enchantment that Tolkien gives you. They want that thrill and that they want the thrill, they want the immersion, they want the wonder that Tolkien provides, while rejecting the metaphysical, spiritual assumptions, the discipline that was necessary to create that world. And so this is why I'll give Ross Douthat's argument. Ross Douthat said that Game of Thrones was in some ways a cheat, because it sold people on the idea that they wanted to see the world as cynically and as Machiavellian and as disenchanted as Martin's vision is, while at the same time giving them the sort of thrill of being a noble knight, or inhabiting this magic world. And so many modern fantasies try to build up enchantment while they're tearing it down at the same time. And that's why you don't get people doing what Tolkien did in 2025 very often.
So I'm going to answer this as a Game of Thrones fan. Actually, I'm on your side on this. I read the first 3 Game of Thrones books, and I just couldn't go any further. But I would assume someone who is a Game of Thrones fan would say, well, Tolkien wrote this reality that's just not going to happen. He wrote good and evil so blatantly obvious in his books, whereas things are a much more gray and murky than that. How would Tolkien answer that?
You know what? I'm not going to give you Tolkien's answer. I'm going to give you C.S. Lewis's answer, because this is what C.S. Lewis had to deal with in his review of Lord of the Rings 60 years ago now, right? When the book comes out, people give that criticism. All the good guys are all good, and all the bad guys are all bad. And Lewis says they see good and bad clearly distinguished, and because they see white and black clearly, they assume that all characters stay all white or all black, like bishops on a chessboard. It's like, this is not how the Lord of the Rings works at all. What people actually object to in Lord of the Rings is not the fact that characters are all good or all bad, because that's stupid, right? That's actually false. Frodo fails at the end, right? Gollum's nearly redeemed. Sam, who is the most selfless character in the book, who is the real hero of the book, it's his act of unthinking hostility to Gollum that ultimately leads Gollum to his final rejection of grace. Just in those 3, you have all this mixture of good and bad. That's to say nothing of Minas Tirith, which is the highest human society, and it's deeply compromised. That's to say nothing of Rohan, which is the heroic society, also deeply compromised. Lewis, much more charitably than I'm going to say it, he said, it strikes me that these people can't have even read the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, where Boromir, who for the purest, for the noblest of intentions, right, nearly falls in this catastrophic fashion. So, no, good and evil, the line of good and evil runs down sort of not between sides, it runs down the heart of every human person in that world, right? It's just the fact that Tolkien knows that there is good and that there is evil and that we're not moral relativists. And that's honestly what people object to. And my gosh, you've read the Silmarillion. You know how muddy and dark and ambiguous things get. Numenor or the Noldor or everything else, right? The idea of the corruption of the good being what the devil rejoices in the most, this is everywhere.
Absolutely. I think on that as well, one thing that George R.R. Martin doesn't necessarily acknowledge as much is the metaphysical. It's what happens after you die. It's almost like when someone dies in Game of Thrones, they're just ejected from the game. They just lost the game, whereas in Tolkien, death is a very viable option. I mean, look at what happened to Gandalf, it's beautiful. And I think that's the Christian side of it that, like you mentioned earlier, is that depth that attracts people who aren't Christian to it. Because we know this to be true. Even if you identify yourself, long ago, I was an atheist, but in moments when life would get incredibly difficult, I found myself in prayer because there's something inside of us knowing that, man, I just need some help. And there's something out there that can help me. Absolutely. So, coming on from that, I want to move into the question that you've probably been asked a lot. Why, and I don't know your opinion on this, I've never heard your opinion on this, but Harry Potter is a topic. I'm going to lay my cards on the table. I love Harry Potter. I'm a Harry Potter fan. What would you think, what is the argument against Harry Potter that Tolkien makes? So I understand, I could be wrong on this, but I was thinking that Tolkien, maybe I am wrong on this, but I thought it was someone that said Tolkien would have been against Harry Potter. But what do you think Tolkien would say about it?
Oh, Harry Potter's tricky, right? Harry Potter's really, really tricky. It's hard to imagine what Tolkien would say on something. And sometimes, I think when you look sometimes at Tolkien's letters and things like this, it really depends on what day you catch him. Some days he's in a good mood. Some days he's in a bad mood. And that's really going to impact how he talks about things. So if I wanted to make my sort of strongest arguments against Harry Potter, I'd make a moral spiritual argument, and then I'd make an aesthetic argument. The moral spiritual argument, if I wanted to make it, I'd say, like, look, man, Rowling goes out of her way to just sort of muddy the waters a little bit, right? Like, do we have to call it witches and wizards? Like, do we have to do that? Do we have to bring in some of all the trappings of like familiars with their toads and their cats and things like that? Do you have to talk about historical witch burnings? So she puts these things in that, like, quite honestly, I could wish were not there, right? That I don't think are necessary for the story. And I think you could say that as a critique. I think on sort of the deeper aesthetic level, I think maybe Tolkien would object to this. When you first read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, it's this sort of world opens up and it's wonderful, and there is this sense of enchantment, right? I still remember the first time I read, glasses clinking to the boy who lived, and like in the way that was sort of enthralling. But then when you get into the world, Hogwarts, it's basically a prep school, right? it's a prep school where you learn techniques. And I think if Tolkien were to object to sort of the fading of the magic, he might note that in some ways what you have is a little bit less magic and a little bit more technology, right? You wave your wand in the right way, you say the right words. This is more scientific magic than it is enchantment, right? So I think he might draw that distinction. That being said, I'm not in the I'm not in the no Harry Potter camp. My kids, when at the right age, my kids read the books, and we don't let them run around playing like
casting spells, but we do let them read the books, and we talk about the books and things like that.
Yeah, I feel very similar to you. I think the really vehement arguments I've heard against Harry Potter seem to be coming from people who really haven't read them. Now I'm with you. I think there's some things that I wish weren't in the story. There's one scene in particular that seems like it's alluding to masturbation, and that sticks in my head. I can't remember which book that is. I want to say it's the 5th book. I want to say.
Okay.
And they're joking about Percy going off and something like that. But anyways, that sticks out in my head, and that's actually the thought that's clung in my head. Like, do I want my kids to read this? But obviously, when they get to a certain age, and they hopefully we've raised them in a virtuous way, and they can understand things like that. But at the same time, I've definitely heard some arguments. I'm like, I don't know if you've actually read it, because is it Tolkien level? No, but it's another one of those stories I think just can give you courage if read in an appropriate light. And there's so much. I mean, it's far more. For writing this as someone who's not a Christian, it's more allegorical toward Christianity than Tolkien even is in a lot of ways. So I want to get to some of the comments that people were asking, some of the questions that they had. One of the questions was, do you see a difference for Tolkien between mythology and fairy stories? It's often attributed to Tolkien that he wanted to create a mythology for England with The Lord of the Rings, but that seems odd given that England already has a founding mythology that he was well aware of, King Arthur and early Christian saints. So I guess the question would be, is there a difference between Tolkien's mythology and fairy stories associated with England?
So here you have to distinguish, and Tolkien will not always be consistent on how he uses the word fairy story. Sometimes he's really precise about it, and the fairy story is like, Brothers Grimm and Andrew Lang and things like that, right? Other times he uses fairy story to be sort of anything that has that air of fairy about it, that air of wonder, that air of a magical world where things have a deeper meaning, the enchanted world. And this is where he says King Arthur is a fairy story, right? Where certain other things aren't. So he's willing to say that the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table is, in fact, a fairy story. Now, why does Tolkien set out to do the mythology for England? You do have, of course, the story of King Arthur. Then you've got the story of the saints and like Bede's ecclesiastical history. And I think we can look at both of these in separate ways. The story of the saints and Bede's ecclesiastical history is not a fairy story because these things are just history, right? Cuthbert did what Cuthbert did, and Theodore and Hadrian did what these guys did. So that's not fairy story stuff. That's not this magical world thing. As for King Arthur, King Arthur's tricky because King Arthur, amongst other things, as it comes down to us, has considerably more in it that's directly bound up with Christianity, where you can't mythologize or fairy tale or subcreate with Christianity in the same way that you can do with other things. You have to have the main objects of primary belief, the things that you believe in most deeply, which would, for Tolkien, be the Trinity and the Incarnation and the Church, right? You can't have those things directly in a fairy story because those aren't sub-creative. Those are just really real. They make the world inconsistent when if you have Legolas encounter the Blessed Virgin, it doesn't work because these exist on different planes of belief. However, in King Arthur, you literally go off for the Holy Grail, which was brought to England by Joseph of Arimathea. Things get a little bit messy when you do that. Let's see. How else would I answer this question? What is the mythology of England supposed to do? It's supposed to give England something like what other European nations have, right? The Finns have the Kalevala, which is this weird, sprawling tale of these shaman bards who are going around doing crazy stuff. They've got this to express their national identity. 100 years before that, you had the made-up epic of Ossian by James Macpherson. So the Irish had this story. It was all made up, but they had this story expressing their national identity in this sort of fairy tale-ish world. And I think that's what Tolkien's trying to do.
That's very well explained. Another question that comes up on this, and this is
rather complex, but people ask this question a lot, and I think this person said it succinctly. Tolkien never wrote a Christ character, but many of the characters show characteristics of Christ. How did he do that with essentially, there's some typos, how did he do that within his characters? How do different characters portray different aspects of Jesus?
So, it's actually kind of obnoxious if you think about it, how many characters display aspects of Jesus. When Tolkien was still alive, somebody wrote a paper arguing that Frodo, Aragorn, and Gandalf represent the three aspects of Christ as priest for Frodo, king for Aragorn, prophet for Gandalf. And Tolkien's like, well, I didn't intend that, but it absolutely works, right? So it totally works. But, this is something I've been thinking about recently. The number of Tolkien's characters that basically do sort of the Christ-like hero's journey. And they've got their call, they've got their mission, they've got their passion, they've got their death, you got the descent, you got the ascension. Like, Gandalf does that because you got the Balrog, and then he comes back up, and now he's Gandalf the White. Aragorn goes down into the land of the dead twice, right? He does it when he goes through the paths of the dead, and he does it when he breaks down, when the Black Gate is broken, and he crosses over into Mordor. So he does this sort of descent into hell twice. Frodo does it. My gosh, how many times does Frodo descend into the dead and then rise again? Merry does it. Pippin does it, right? It's something that happens so very frequently. And I think there are two ways you can answer the question. One is you can say, well, that's just how a hero's journey works, and you can do the sort of standard archetypal story. But I think you can also say Christianity takes this archetypal story and makes it the central thing that you meditate on in every single Mass. Every single Mass, you're meditating on the descent of Christ into the incarnation, the passion of Christ, his death, burial, resurrection, ascension. Every Mass has that pattern. And so when Tolkien sets out to write characters, yeah, he's going to do the archetype that everybody else does, but that archetype is going to have the Christ stamp on it so very clearly.
Oh, that's so good. And before I get to these other comments, I do want to ask about the liturgical imagination. And I'm going to be very honest with you. I had zero concept of this, before hearing you and Dr. Hahn talk about it. And wow, I was blown away. And I started to think through, as a father, how can I, in our domestic church, how can we start to create this domestic liturgy within our family? Could you elaborate on just liturgical imagination and some of those concepts that Tolkien interwove into his world?
Yeah. So, and I would step back and say, like, he's not interweaving it. It's just how he interacts with the world itself, right? So the idea of liturgical imagination ultimately is a term that ultimately comes from an English Dominican mid-20th century named Conrad Pepler. He points out that if you go to Mass regularly, enter into it deeply, and if the Mass does its work well, it's going to leave Christ stamped on the imagination. It's going to leave your whole imaginative faculty Christo-formed. Can you say that? It's going to leave the pattern of the liturgy in your mind so that you naturally and subconsciously recreate it throughout your daily life. If you've done this well. Tolkien is somebody who went to daily Mass, for most of his life. He's somebody who would memorize huge chunks of the Mass. He's somebody who could memorize the proper prayers for individual Masses from year to year. And he would just be like, oh, we're coming into Christmas. And then he can quote the introit for Christmas without looking it up. Like, this is the sort of depth of engagement he had. And so if you're meditating on the law of the Lord day and night like that, if you're meditating on the liturgy day and night, this will naturally reproduce itself. I notice my screen's getting pretty dark because the sun is setting. Should I flick on a light here? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, go for it. No, you're fine. Yeah, go for it.
No, I've got big windows here, and it started off and it was nice and bright, but the sun sets early in Steubenville and the moon is rising out my windows. So
I thought you might have been doing it for effect. The deeper you got, the darker it get. I didn't. That's totally fine. Oh, that's so good. And it's such an interesting concept because within my Protestant raising, there's no kind of concept of liturgy. So this is something new that I was hit on very recently, and then getting in with the Mass, I understand Tolkien would, I think it was actually you that said this, but he told his son when he went off to World War II to memorize the Mass in Latin so that if he wasn't able to have Mass, he could recite it to himself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, you memorize the Roman canon and memorize all these prayers. And again, when he's writing to Christopher, he says, memorize the Magnificat, memorize the Litany of Loretto, memorize these Psalms so that when you have cause to rejoice, you've got the right words to express it. And can you imagine what you or I would be like if we get some good news and the first thing we do is, my soul magnifies the Lord, my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. Because this is apparently what Tolkien did.
Oh, that's so good. That changed our entire world. That's definitely, you've given me a new goal. That's amazing. That's really good. This is another one of the comments that I want to get to. Does Tolkien, this is interesting. Does Tolkien ever talk about his birthplace in South Africa? And did that have any impact on his writing on the rolling hills?
So he does talk about it briefly. He has only the vaguest memories of his birthplace in South Africa. And he acknowledges that there are some things that might sort of creep through, but this is all sort of in the misty past for him. The thing that he acknowledges and the thing that most people recognize as sort of the big thing is when he and his mother and brother moved to the English countryside and sort of, this rural back part of England at Sarhole, when his imagination was just forming as like the deep formation. But South Africa is acknowledged as something that does have some effect.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
The final comment that I'm going to ask you, and this is the one you've been waiting for, do you think that there is a relationship between the One Ring and sin?
Yes.
Okay.
No. So,
and they go on, they say, if so, can you explain?
yeah. So look, so we'll go big and then we'll go really, really precise. If you want to do the big thing, right? Yeah, of course, there's a relationship between the One Ring and sin, right? There's a reason why Tolkien has the ring destroyed on March 25th when Frodo ascends the mountain carrying this burden. It's cast in. March 25th is the date of the Annunciation. It's also the traditional date for Good Friday. So this is the realm of Sauron being ended forever as we ascend the mountain and all this. So yes, in that way, Tolkien says that March 25th was deliberately chosen by him as the date for the destruction of the ring. That's why, because there is that connection between the ring and sin. If we want to dive down and sort of drill into the story, the ring is a special kind of sin, and it's the sin that Tolkien is always most worried about. It's the desire for power, it's the desire for domination, it's the desire to seize in possessiveness more than God has granted in his bounty. And that's what the ring is ultimately doing, right? So the ring represents this dark magic of sin, which you can accomplish in all sorts of ways. You can accomplish it through technology, you can accomplish it through dictatorship, you can accomplish it through a magic ring. But it's representing, again, very much in an Augustinian sense, the lust for power, the lust for domination. And that's what it is most sort of concretely in the story.
Can you contrast that with the Silmarils, particularly how the story with Sam, Sam saying, oh, we're still in that story when they have the Light of Galadriel, which is really just a remnant of a Silmaril. But there were also these things that caused immense destruction because of the greed that men carried over them. How could the ring have been used for good? I know Gandalf says it would have perverted him,
No, so the ring could not be used for good because what it really is again, will for domination. And we can reflect that in our impatience with the state of the world. If I could push a button and make everyone the way I wanted to, the temptation would be very, very strong, but God doesn't want me to do that. So that sort of dominion over other wills is something that God doesn't give to his creatures. So that can't be used right. As for the Silmarils, it's as a symbol in the story, the Silmarils are really tricky, right? Because on the one hand, they're hallowed. They're hallowed and they're pure. They preserve the last sort of unfallen light or untainted light from the light of the trees. So they are so good. But because of the way they get bound up in sin, right? Because of the way they get bound up in the lust for power and the lust for domination, they themselves can become things of destruction, right? They don't have to, because Earendil's not, but they tend to do that. So they're a much more complicated symbol, which are things good in themselves that become, because of contentious, envious desire, objects of strife. So they're more complicated, but the ring is in that way more simple.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. And I've got two other questions for you. One's really short, and one can be as long as you want it to be. This is entirely for you as someone who has studied Tolkien so much. You're so familiar with him. What are some things that Tolkien wrote that still perplex you or still have mystery to you and that you're still pondering?
So one thing would be the Silmarils. Okay, the Silmarils are interesting. So that's one thing. There are all sorts of things when I read Tolkien where I just still marvel and just sort of sit and I'm touched. Tolkien on death is an idea that has been written about a couple of times. It's been explored. Deeper understanding of Tolkien on death, I think, is something that I would like to have, because death is a gift, actually, for Tolkien. It's the gift God gives to the human race. So I think that holiness in Tolkien. I know a little bit about how holiness works in Tolkien. This actually gets tied back to the question of the Silmarils, but I don't know how deep that rabbit hole goes. So those are three things that I think are really, really interesting. I'll stop there. there.
I'm just really curious now. Could you elaborate a little bit on the holiness aspect? I think of Galadriel when you say that, but could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So here are things that people generally accept about Tolkien, okay? One thing that they generally accept is that Tolkien is in some way influenced by Rudolf Otto with the idea of the holy, which is this big work in sort of history and philosophy of religion from the early 20th century, where he talks about, the great and tremendous mystery of holiness. And I think that's there. How much is Tolkien like Otto? I don't know. I'd like to get that in my head. Here's another thing that's, I think, really, really interesting. There's a book that nobody reads anymore. It's called Tolkien and the Silmarillion by Clyde Kilby. Kilby was a Wheaton English professor. He went over to England for a summer and sort of assisted Tolkien when he was trying to pull the Silmarillion together. Eventually, Kilby was he's sort of forgotten in Tolkien scholarship. But in this little book, he says, Professor Tolkien and I were talking at great length about the use of the word holy in his works. And very specifically, he told me that the secret fire, which was sent to burn at the heart of the world at creation, is the Holy Spirit. So here's the question, right? If Tolkien actually said that, every reason to believe he did, how deep does that rabbit hole go? That's something that's a project that's a little bit on a back burner right now. But holiness in Tolkien, and then especially the Holy Spirit in Tolkien, is something that I think needs to be sussed out a little bit.
I am the keeper of the secret flame. Isn't that? Should Tolkien be a saint?
Should Tolkien be a saint?
That's totally off the cuff.
So, I don't know.
Great answer.
I'll say I don't know, right? I'll give you maybe two reasons for thinking yes, then I'll give you one reason for sort of pumping the brakes, right? Like, on the one hand, he did something that was monumental, that has moved so many hearts. And if you just look at, if you point to the founder of a religious order and say, see what great things the order has done, maybe there's something to think about here. Maybe if you think about the conversions and the transformations and the deepening of faith, maybe there's something to think about there. He certainly seems to have had a life that was basically centered around God. He certainly seems to have done so many good things there. There's it doesn't seem like the most implausible thing in the world to me. I know some people have tried to get a cause going. I don't know where the cause is right now. The one thing that would be interesting, this is something that would have to happen. We've got some of Tolkien's letters, right? We've got some of what he wrote, but the Tolkien's letters book, which is this thick, could fill a shelf probably, right? The vast majority of the stuff that's out there we haven't seen. So before I should say, should he be saying, do I think it'd be really cool? Absolutely. I think it'd be really cool, right? I find it, I would love it, right? But the sorts of investigations that would have to go in first, we've got a whole life in writings that people would have to go through. And so I'd be happy to see that happen.
Yep.
But the short answer is I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great answer too. I think that's a very appropriate answer. The final question I had for you. Should Pope Leo define and declare that all Catholics should read Lord of the Rings?
That strikes me as exactly the right use of papal authority.
Absolutely. You don't have to answer that to put you on the spot. I'm going to say yes. Come on, Pope Leo, do it.
No, but it's one of those things where if all Catholics don't have to read it, I do think that fostering awareness of it and fostering that sort of dimension of the faith, because there are some ways I think our faith has sort of grown weaker imaginatively in the past 200 years. And I think deepening those roots would be to the good for pretty much everybody.
Amen. Absolutely. Wow. Dr. Reinhard, thank you so much for spending time and sharing your knowledge with us. Guys, if you have not read The High Hallow, I'm in that boat. I'm about to get it. You should read it. I can only imagine that we're going to dive into just the wealth of your knowledge of this book and get into more of that liturgical imagination that Tolkien talks about. And that's the concept right now that I'm just fixated on. After hearing you speak on it, I think I listened to you talk about this, I want to say a year and a half ago. I've been totally fixated on it. And how can I cultivate this liturgical thought, the underlying base of my life being this liturgy that just defines how I live. It's just a beautiful concept. So Dr. Reinhard, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Sean. It was a great time. Yeah.
Would love to have you back at some point and we can nerd out on more topics.
Anytime.
Love it. Thank you. Just to check out The High Hallow by Dr. Ben Reinhard. I'm going to get a copy and I'm going to read through it as well. Just the wealth of knowledge that he has. I feel like we're only able just to tap into it on this interview. Hopefully we'll be able to do more interviews and learn more from Dr. Reinhard. But just a great conversation. I keep on thinking and pontificating on this concept of liturgical imagination and how I can implement the liturgy that we go to at Mass into my life and into the life of my family. Such a pivotal topic, I believe, in the life of a Christian. So hopefully this was a beneficial episode for you. If it was, please consider subscribing. It helps us out a lot. I appreciate it a ton. Helps us to reach more people. We will see you next time on Lexio.